The Fall of Cadia is often considered to be the greatest defeat humanity has ever suffered in the lore of Warhammer 40K. So, in this video, I'm going to explain exactly how one of the last bastions of humanity standing against the Eye of Terror succumbed to the chaos forces within and brought about the dreaded Era Indomitus that split the entire galaxy in two. But first, here's some context on why Cadia was such an important stronghold for humanity. Cadia was located at the mouth of the only reliable route in and out of the Eye of Terror, the Cadian Gate, essentially making it a crucial line of defence against any invasions from the forces of chaos. But there was another reason Cadia was such a major threat to the chaos forces. Scattered around the entire planet were these large black stone obelisks called the Cadian Pylons. These pylons had been set up by a race of skeletal robot warriors called the Necrons to combat psychic energies during the legendary battle in heaven. The Necrons went to sleep millions of years ago, but had left these pylons behind. Over time, their new purpose became holding back the psychic warp energy of the Eye of Terror and ensuring that the area around the Cadian Gate remained stable. However, that didn't save Cadia from becoming a target of the forces of chaos for the past 10,000 years. At first, the planet was ill-equipped to handle these attacks, barely surviving and suffering a huge number of casualties in every battle. But over time, the Cadians began reforming their culture and world while also heavily fortifying their defences to defend against future attacks. They became a militarised culture where 72% of the world's population was drafted into its military, and social classes were determined by military rank. Every Cadian, right from the moment they learned how to walk, was trained on how to field strip, assemble and fire a gun, even before they were taught how to read and write. This made the Cadian Shock Troopers easily one of the best regiments in the entire Astra Militarum. The Cadians also changed how they structured their cities, rebuilding every new city around a central fortress called a casa. These casas were surrounded by hundreds of gun placements scattered across its perimeter, a moat controlled by hydraulic bridges for getting across, and an inner wall also manned by several hundred gun placements, providing each fortress with 3 separate layers of protection against any invaders. Even the streets inside, which were previously constructed in the traditional high Terran style with broad ordered avenues, were rebuilt in elaborate geometric patterns, with every street laid out like notches on a key, forming an intricate puzzle. The idea was to confuse the invaders and help the Cadian military, trained in advanced urban combat, hold each street for several years at a time. All of these efforts made Cadia the most well-defended fortress world just after Terra itself. And to the forces of chaos, the planet now became an obstacle to their quest of removing the Emperor from his throne. Cadia had to be conquered. But with all of its defences, Cadia would not be easy to take from the outside. So instead of attacking the planet directly, the Chaos forces decided to weaken it from within and cut off its support from the rest of the Imperium. This began with 12 different attacks across different sectors of the Imperium, which later became known as the 12 Black Crusades. These crusades were headed by their new War Master of Chaos, Abaddon the Despoiler, who took the title from his gene father Horus after his death at the hands of the Emperor in the Horus Heresy. Commanding the Black Legion of Chaos Space Marines, Abaddon's 12 Black Crusades were designed to distract Imperial forces, spread chaos corruption throughout the Imperium, and most importantly, empower him and his forces. For example, his first Black Crusade earned him the mighty demon blade Draconian when he recovered it from below the Tower of Silence, while his 6th Black Crusade helped him substantially increase the size of his Black Legion by conquering a rival warband. Finally, in his 12th Black Crusade, he acquired 2 Blackstone fortresses, alien-constructed, planet-sized star forts that also served as strategic warp-based weapons. Now with these powerful weapons at his disposal, Abaddon finally decided that it was time to attack Cadia directly. After getting the blessing of the Chaos Gods, Abaddon launched his 13th Black Crusade. Phase 1 began with several battleships emerging in the Cadian sector. These were led by Typhus of the Death Guard, whose plague fleet launched massive plague campaigns within their Cadian sector, causing disease and sickness that ravaged a huge number of the Imperium's naval forces. As this disease spread to the civilians, it also created massive cults who believed that this attack from the Chaos forces was the Emperor punishing them for their sins. This started several revolts throughout the Cadian sector, creating unrest across the many vital worlds surrounding the Cadian Gate. Seizing this opportunity, even more Chaos battleships emerged out of the Eye of Terror and started converging on the world's neighbouring Cadia, attempting to isolate the fortress world from the rest of the Imperial forces in the sector. However, Cadia remained steadfast, dispatching their troops to these worlds to quash these rebellions and fight off the invaders. All the while, the Cadian Pylons continued battling against the dangerous warp energies emanating from the Eye of Terror. The Cadian forces were initially successful in beating back the invaders and rebels, and were eventually called back to their homeworld under the threat of Abaddon launching a direct attack on Cadia itself. But that decision would ultimately end up leading to one of the most tragic moments in Cadia's history. Upon their return, one of the regiments, the Volskani Cataphracts, corrupted by chaos, turned on the Cadian High Command, slaughtering them all before the real battle could even begin. With the situation rapidly spiralling out of control, the legendary Lord Castellan Ursakar E decided to take control of the situation. Mustering up a battalion of the 8th Cadian Shock Troopers, he confronted the traitors head-on. Together, they beat the Cataphracts back long enough for the rest of the Loyalists to regroup and crush the traitors completely. Recognising his quick thinking and heroism in dealing with the traitors, Ursakar E was swiftly promoted to Governor of Cadia, and his first official decision was to go on the offensive by sending Cadian Kasrkin forces directly into the Eye of Terror to gain any intel they could about the enemy forces. At the same time, he sent for Space Marine reinforcements, and as they arrived, organised them into groups to prepare Cadia's defences. But before the bulk of the reinforcements could arrive, Abaddon launched his biggest attack yet. He sent a massive army of Chaos forces through the Eye of Terror, the likes of which had never been seen since the Horus Heresy 10,000 years ago. The worlds closest to the Eye were taken over immediately. The Chaos forces had gained a strong enough footing in the sector, and now Abaddon ordered a direct attack on Cadia itself. The attack began with a massive orbital bombardment of the planet's surface, quickly followed by the arrival of Abaddon's main invasion force, consisting of several huge legions of Chaos Space Marines, Demons and Titans. This gigantic army was led by the demon priest Urkanthos, Abaddon's second in command. The Chaos Forces' initial advances were all successful, letting them besiege and eventually destroy many important casters across the planet. The trail of destruction continued, and they continued their march towards Cadia's central castle, Castle Kraf. The Cadian forces found themselves on the brink of defeat, but in a dark moment of despair, a ray of hope suddenly appeared. The Space Wolves, Blood Angels, Dark Angels, Black Templars, and Imperial Fists, they all arrived at Cadia with not a moment to spare. These Space Marine chapters, combined with the ever-resilient Cadian Shock Troopers and White Scars, launched a massive counterattack, pushing back Abaddon's forces. Finally, the Imperial hero Saint Celestine arrived with a host of Adeptus Sororitas. The outcome of this brutal battle now seemed all but decided as a Cadian victory. But, just as Abaddon's defeat seemed imminent, even more Chaos forces erupted out of the Eye of Terror. Several warbands of word-bearers who unleashed a tide of demons and warp storms, cutting off communication between Imperial forces. Other Chaos warbands joined the assault on the other planets in the Cadian sector. This was all part of Abaddon's plan. He was clearly employing a divide and conquer strategy. But he was still facing some major resistance from the Imperial Navy, who had started turning the tide of the battle in space. The Navy had realised that destroying the Chaos battleships on a planetary level was pointless. So, they focused their forces on breaking the larger Chaos blockade that had formed a ring around Cadia to give new reinforcements an open path to the planet. More Imperial reinforcements arrived and joined the fight. They actually managed to push back Abaddon's Chaos forces. But just when the Imperial's victory seemed all but assured, the second half of Abaddon's fleet began emerging from the Eye of Terror. Led personally by Abaddon commanding the Blackstone fortresses, the Will of Eternity, he made quick work of the Imperial fleet, and more Chaos forces soon poured into Cadia. Lord Creed realised how disastrous it could be to let a Blackstone fortress get close enough to attack Cadia directly. So, he dispatched a small group of Imperial fists to infiltrate the Will of Eternity, who against all odds are able to begin a counter-attack from within the fortress. They take out many of Abaddon's elite guardsmen and disrupt the gigantic starship's control system to slow down its progress. But before they could finally kill Abaddon, his remaining guard rallied to protect their War Master, bringing the battle inside the fortress to a stalemate. But on Cadia's surface, the Chaos forces were getting closer to penetrating Castle Kraf, the linchpin fortress of the world. The demon priest Urkathos, along with the hounds of Abaddon, had managed to penetrate its golden Cadian gates. The only thing holding the Chaos forces back from completely overrunning the Casa was a small regiment of Kasakins inside, who bravely stood their ground and demolished hundreds of Chaos Space Marines and demons in a show of absolute defiance. But despite their bravery, the enemy's numbers were too much for them to handle alone. Just as they were about to completely be overwhelmed, another batch of reinforcements arrived. To the Kasakins' surprise, the Necrons led by Lord Trezin the Infinite had awoken from their slumber and made their way directly to Cadia. Since their only purpose was to fight the energies of the warp regardless of who wielded them, they fought alongside the soldiers of the Imperium. Also arriving was the Mechanicus Magos Belisarius Karl and his Harlequins. Together, they launched another counterattack and pushed Urkathos' forces back long enough for Saint Celestine to rejoin the battle. With her help, the now bolstered Cadian forces pushed most of the invaders outside the gate. But in all the chaos, Urkathos managed to slip into Casacraft with a small force of the Hounds of Abaddon. His target was the Null Array, which powered the void shield surrounding Cadia. This shield had the power to defend against the Blackstone Fortress's warp beam, and disabling it would ensure Cadia and its pylons' complete destruction. On his way to the Null Array, Urkathos engaged in several bloody duels with the Sisters of Battle, defeating a large number of them before finally reaching his goal. Just as he was about to fulfill his master's wish and destroy the array, he was ambushed by Saint Celestine. The two engaged in a ferocious battle, dealing several critical blows to each other. Saint Celestine emerged as the winner, but before Urkathos was vanquished, he managed to complete his mission of destroying the Null Array, deactivating the void shield surrounding Cadia. The Cadians now knew that Abaddon could activate the Will of Eternity's warp beam at any moment, destroying Cadia completely. But the Lord Castellan wasn't one to sit idle and wait for death to come. So Creed commanded the Imperial fist still inside the Will of Eternity to launch a last-ditch assault on the remaining Chaos forces. With the help from the Legion of the Damned Marines, who somehow managed to make their way onto the ship and defeat most of the Chaos forces protecting Abaddon. But by the time they reached Abaddon, they had lost too many men and their numbers were too few to defeat the War Master of Chaos himself, and he quickly obliterated them. But what Abaddon did not know, this desperate attack was just meant to buy time for the Imperial Fist's own planet-sized fortress monastery, the Phalanx, to arrive on the scene. The Phalanx attacked and partially destroyed the Will of Eternity, disabling its warp beam. Humiliated, Abaddon retreated back into the Eye of Chaos, giving the Imperial forces time to regroup and come up with a new strategy. The Cadian High Command realised quickly that they had one hope for defeating Abaddon and his forces for good, harnessing the full power of the Cadian Pylons. They formed an uneasy alliance with Trezin the Infinite's Necrons, since he was the only one with deep knowledge about their inner workings of the Pylons. Together, Trezin and Belisarius Karl made their way underground in an attempt to amplify the Pylons' power. But before they could achieve any real progress, Abaddon learned of their plan through the psychic resonance produced by the amplification ritual. He hastily teleported to their location, along with a few of his elite guard, the Bringers of Despair, to stop the ritual. However, standing in his way was Ursakar E. Creed and his bearer Jaron Kell. As the battle ensued, Jaron Kell heroically gave up his own life in order to give Creed enough time to escape. Abaddon continued making his way to confront Trezin and Belisarius Karl. As he was about to disrupt their ritual, Creed returned with a Vostrorian regiment and attacked him again. The Necron overlord Trezin joined the battle as well by unleashing his Tesseract Labyrinth, a pocket-dimensional prison where the Necron Lord collected historical figures that seemed interesting to him. From the artifact, he summoned several units from his collection, including Heresy Era Ultramarines, Dreadnoughts, and the Inquisitor Greyfax. Soon, the remnants of the Space Wolves and Saint Celestine also converged on the battle's location, and Abaddon suffered a fatal blow by Saint Celestine, forcing him to retreat into the Eye of Terror once again. This allowed Trezin and Karl to finally complete their amplification ritual. They used the newly boosted pylons to dispel all the warp storms in the Cadian sector, and banish every Chaos Demon back to the ether. With their new trump card, the Imperial forces managed to push the forces of Chaos all the way back to the Eye of Terror. For most of the Imperial forces, this was already a huge victory, but Karl and Trezin continued working on something bigger. They'd figure out a way to use the Cadian Pylon network's full anti-psychic capabilities to close the Eye of Terror for good. But before they could complete their grand plan, Abaddon, in one final act of desperation, decided to thrust the remnants of the Will of Eternity, as an artificial asteroid towards the surface of Cadia. Upon impact, the surface of Cadia started to crack and split, as the tectonic plates beneath the planet started falling apart. The 8th Cadian Regiment, along with Ursakar E Creed, heroically made their last stand against the remaining Chaos forces, giving as many Cadians as possible the time to escape. During this final rearguard action, Lord Castellan Creed mysteriously went missing. Some say he was kidnapped by Trazyn the Infinite to become another warrior in his collection, while others say he perished in the final battle. Most of the other heroes, however, did manage to make it out, including Saint Celestine, Belisarius Cael, and Inquisitor Greyfax, along with some remnants of the Space Wolves and Imperial Fists. In the end, Cadia was ultimately destroyed and Abaddon the Despoiler was victorious. The planet's destruction also meant the destruction of the Cadian Pylons that had long kept the Eye of Terror at bay, and without their anti-psychic capabilities, the warp spilled over into real space. The Eye of Terror expanded until it became the Great Rift that teared the galaxy into two halves, the Imperium Sanctus and the Imperium Nihilus, the latter half being a nightmarish, isolated realm of constant chaos invasions, warp storms, and anarchy. However, all was not lost for the Imperium. Shortly after the fall of Cadia, the remaining heroes Cael, Saint Celestine, and Greyfax, with the help of the power of the Eldari god of the dead, Yenid, through his priestess Yvraine, were able to resurrect Primarch Roboute Guilliman, who immediately jumped into action by launching the Indomitus Crusade to stabilise and reclaim several lost worlds, both in the Imperium Sanctus and the Imperium Nihilus, officially starting the Era Indomitus. As for the Cadians, about 3 million of them were able to escape off-world and scattered across the galaxy to settle into new worlds. However, even though they were scattered, their culture was never lost. Their fighting spirit is still as strong as ever, as they continue to fight the Imperium's enemies across the galaxy. Whole generations of Cadian Shock Troopers are born, raised, and trained on warships en route to new battlefields. As their reputation as one of the most professional and efficient Astra Militarum regiments is still as strong as ever. In fact, many of the other regiments have adopted much of Cadian culture and tactics for themselves, proving that even though their homeworld was destroyed, the Cadian way will never die out. Because even in the face of insurmountable odds, where victory seems impossible, Cadia stands.